Hi, and welcome back. This video is sponsored by Cableguys. Here's a question for you. What do all your one-shot drum samples have in common? I'm talking about analog samples, samples of vintage drum machines, or hi-fi multi-samples of real drum kits. They're all trimmed right before the initial transient. They kind of have to be, right? You need them to hit immediately when you play the key or hit the pad, so that transient has to be right at the front of the sample. If you've ever recorded and edited a real drum kit, however, and especially if you've ever attempted to make a drum kit multi-sample, you'll know that there's stuff before that transient. Sometimes you have to make a judgment about exactly where that transient starts. Maybe it's emerging from a wash of noise and ambience. Maybe it's the air starting to move as the drummer's arm moves down. I've never really been a vinyl guy, but I have memories of club nights and illicit parties back in my youth when real DJs played real records. And my memory tells me that 909 kicks played from Technic's decks through a sound system that's on the verge of catching fire just hit differently. I don't know whether to blame the stylus on the deck, the group delay from scooped subs, or something else entirely, but I remember those kicks having a kind of thwump at the start. They didn't hit the same way as my 909 kick samples do on my monitors. Some of the more careful and meticulous producers are aware of this and will manually place samples just ahead of the beat on the timeline. But one of those producers, namely BT, got sufficiently sick of doing this manually and teamed up with Cableguys to help speed up their workflow. So the result is Snapback. Before I take you through the options, let's first have a listen to the kind of difference it can make. Here's some drums with a vintage drum machine kind of flavour. It's not actually a vintage drum machine, it's samples of my son's not quite a toy little drum kit, which pleases me on multiple levels. But anyway, listen to what happens if I use Snapback to add subtle little pre-samples in front of the kicks, snares and hi-hats. Quite a remarkable difference, right? Somehow simultaneously quite subtle, but also really profound. It's the feel that changes for me. Without Snapback, it's slow, plodding, kind of boring. With it, it's laid back, groovy, interesting. That's how I perceive it anyway. Feel free to disagree in the comments. Let's take a closer look at what I've done, starting with the kick. We've got a nice big display showing us the incoming kick drum waveform with our Snapback sample superimposed. Let's solo that sample. It seems rather insignificant on its own. And yet, coming just before the transient, it totally changes the feel of the drum. Let's reset the gain to unity so you can hear it more clearly. And I'll also reset the attack envelope parameter so we hear the whole sample. Of course, the choice of sample is critical. This one is from the reverse deep category. The factory samples are organised into groups to make it easier to find something appropriate. If I pick something from a different category, we get a very different effect. In this case, I wanted something that would blend with the kick sample and just sound like an earlier extension of the same drum. So I went with the reverse column and the deep category and the low whip 1 sample. Shortened the attack quite a bit and dropped the gain by about 9 dB. It's amazing how, even at this low level and short duration, it still significantly changes the feel. took a totally different approach for the snare. This time I picked a clap sample. If I toggle this off, we're left with just a snare sound. So we're adding a layer of clap to the sample, which obviously changes its character. But importantly, the clap hits just before the snare drum. We can tweak the exact timing using the shift parameter. And if you press the detail button, you can zoom the display tight enough to see the waveforms. When the snapback sample is similar in character to the incoming audio, you might need to check the phase relationship where they overlap, and either adjust the timing or flip the polarity to get a better match. In this case, there's very little correlation between the clap sample and the incoming snare, so the polarity of the sample doesn't really matter. This time I didn't adjust the sample envelope at all, but I did wind down the low-pass filter over to the right to make it sound a bit darker and less hi-fi. Let's look at the hi-hat. I had to tweak the triggering settings for this one, as some of the quieter velocity hits were dropping below the threshold. I also had to turn up the detail slider to make sure every hit triggered correctly. Most of the time you probably won't need to touch these settings, however. So far I haven't needed to switch to the general or complex algorithms at all. It doesn't really make sense to use this plugin unless there's a good solid transient that you need to add to, so I imagine the drums algorithm will be fine in most cases. Anyway, this time I picked Weird Tambourine from the Special Weird category. I've shortened the attack considerably, so it's just adding a very short pre-fade in, but touched nothing else other than the gain. As subtle as this is, it still seems significant to me. Without the snapback samples, it feels rigidly metronomic and robotic. With them, they're just as strictly quantized as before, but the timing feels less like a rule and more like a guideline. That's how I perceive it anyway. Of course, you don't have to stick to just drums. Here's an 808, which has nothing to do with a TR-808 drum machine. I just mean a synth patch with a kick drum style attack, plus a long, pitched, decaying tail. Let's start by double-checking the triggering, as it's not a traditional drum sound. And yes, it's fine. The source is plenty loud enough, and it has no trouble triggering on every hit with the default settings. So let's close this window again and pick a snapback sample. I'm a big Terry Pratchett fan, so let's start with Discworld from the reverse whip category. That's pretty cool, right? A bit too stereo, perhaps? You can dial that back with the width parameter. Or exaggerate it if you like. Or maybe you want it mono, but panned. Or maybe we haven't found the right sample yet. Let's try the short analog category. Those are cool, but maybe we need to be weirder. Much as I'm enjoying these, they're not quite what I was looking for. Let's go back to the reverse whip category. And this one feels about right. Let's warm it up a bit with the low-pass filter and turn it down a bit. Now, the more observant of you may have noticed there's a whole other sample section labelled Transient. This is basically the same as the snapback section, except it triggers on the transient instead of ahead of it, and provides a completely different set of samples. If I pick one and solo the transient section, we've just done a sample replace. So let's have a browse through the factory samples. They're organised into categories once again, but notice we have 2 columns for kick, labelled attack and body, and 2 for snare, called sizzle and weight. This takes a slightly different approach compared to other sample replacement plugins I've tried, in that most of these aren't really intended as full, complete drum samples, rather as component elements of a good drum sound. If your kick needs a bit more attack, the click section might be just the ticket. And because these samples don't have any low boom content, they're not going to interfere with that part of your original kick sound. You're not limited to these, of course. You can drag your own samples in instead. Or you can add them to the user library so they show up in the menu alongside the factory samples. But in my opinion, a lot of the value in this plugin lies in the choice of samples from BT and a few other well-known producers, which are very good at providing just that element that's missing from your input signal. In this case, I think I want a bit more initial thump. So let's try the kick body column and the source category. Test boom is close. Let's try pitching it up a bit. And I'll tighten up the envelope decay and maybe roll off some of that top end again. Let's zoom into that waveform display to check how they align. Maybe I'll nudge that sample a millisecond or two earlier. It's probably wise to check the polarity when doing this kind of thing, but I'm not hearing much difference when I switch, suggesting that there's still very little correlation with the input signal. Of course, layering a sample onto the incoming transients is likely to result in increased peak levels, so you can enable a limiter if that's a problem, and see its threshold in relation to the waveform on the display. Personally, I rarely use limiters when mixing, preferring to just mix with plenty of headroom instead, so I've left this off for the most part, but it's there if you need it. So let's listen to the difference that makes. And now let's try toggling bypass for all 4 instances of snapback in this arrangement on kick, snare, hats, and 808. Again, somehow, simultaneously, quite a small difference, yet also huge and very important. So BT's involvement suggests this plugin is aimed at the more electronic end of music production, and clearly it ticks those boxes very well. But I was also curious about its possible applications for real acoustic drums. I got to wondering if adding subtle pre-samples might help to make programmed MIDI drums sound more convincingly like a real drum kit. And I wonder if the transient sample stage would be more useful to me when mixing real drums than more traditional sample replacement options. Let's talk about that briefly. I actually tend to avoid sample replacement most of the time, not for any purist dogmatic reasons, just because it usually takes me longer to get samples to fit naturally with the original recording than it does for me to fix the issues in other ways, especially for snare drums with ghost notes. One of those other methods I might resort to would involve trying to synthesize or otherwise add in just those specific elements of the sound that are lacking in the original part. If a kick drum is just missing some attack, adding a sample of just attack transient will fix that without messing anything up elsewhere. So here's what I did for the kick drum. For maximum authenticity, I should maybe have loaded a pedal squeak sample for the snapback, but I decided that our virtual drummer has a squeak-free pedal, so what I've got is a very short thwip to represent the movement of the air as the beater approaches the drumhead. The transient sample is a vinyl click sound with a tight, fast envelope, and nudged early a tiny bit to make sure it's definitely at the front of the drum hit. Now, I'm faking these drums with samples, specifically Abbey Road 80s drummer running in Contact, so I had full control over MIDI velocities and I'm once again going to leave the dynamics parameter at 100%. This means the sample will have exactly the same dynamic variation as the input signal. That's something that I suspect is a lot easier to say than to implement in code. But the Cableguys developers seem to have found a way to make it work without fuss, and my ears tell me it tracks the dynamics very accurately. When you're working with actual real drummers, however, you don't get to edit velocity in a piano roll, and sometimes the performance isn't quite as consistent as you'd like it. In that case, you have the option to turn down the dynamics to make sure that click, or whatever it is that you're adding, hits with the right impact every time. In this case, however, I'm going to stick with 100% and fix any such issues in the piano roll instead. Okay, here's my snare drum setting. I've gone with the air duct snapback sample. While for the transient, I've gone for a bright snare wires kind of thing from the snare sizzle category. Those 80s drummer samples only give me a single snare channel. There's no separate top and bottom mics. Adding a bit of this gives me the same kind of extra snap and brightness that turning up the bottom snare mic might provide if I'd mic'd a real kit. I have 4 more instances in this setup covering the 4 tom channels, but they're all set up pretty much exactly the same as the kick drum, so I won't repeat myself. Instead, let's try toggling bypass for all 6 instances in context with the mix and see how big a difference it makes. So perhaps a casual listener would describe that as a small difference. But from my perspective as a mix engineer, it's huge. It's the kind of difference you might chase for hours with conventional tools like compression and EQ, possibly without success. But this just took a few minutes and a handful of clicks. It's not that it sounds bad when they're bypassed. Those are good quality, well-recorded samples after all, and I've tried not to ruin them with my mix. But that's just better, right? Clearer, better defined, harder hitting. I suspect I'll get a lot of use out of this when mixing real drums in the future. Because the reality is, not every drummer is John Bonham. When the drummer's dynamics are on point and they can balance themselves in the room well, and when the drum kit is perfectly tuned and the room sounds great, you can record them with a single mic and hit it with some compression and it'll sound amazing. At the other end of the scale, you've got the drummer with no control over their dynamics, that thrashes the hi-hats and cymbals as hard as the shells, that didn't tune the kit, or replace the heads before the session, or possibly ever. In that case, you can use 20 mics and it'll still sound bad. Sample replacement is probably your best option there. I'm lucky that I no longer have to deal with the latter these days, but also the stars rarely align quite perfectly for the first scenario either. When the drums are basically sounding good, but just missing a certain something, the most efficient strategy is arguably to identify what that missing something is and simply add it. This is a quintessentially Cableguys product, in my opinion. They seem to have a knack for identifying clunky bits of workflow and providing easy solutions that seem like they should have been obvious all along. If I want rhythmic ducking these days, I'm more likely to load Shaper Box and a volume shaper than to mess about with compressors and sidechain signals. When I wanted a guitar part to flip backwards in this mix, it was quicker and easier to use a time shaper in another Shaper Box than to edit it in my DAW. And in this case, layering in samples with Snapback was quicker, easier, and possibly also more effective than trying to add that extra snap and attack with conventional tools like compression and EQ. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks for watching.